Hi, everyone. I'm Paul with MadCap Software. Source control, also known as version control, also known as my nemesis, because yes, I do have a love-hate relationship with source control. I always have. I think I'm not alone in that. A lot of people do. You love it because when it works the way that you think it's supposed to work or the way that you want it to work and everything's just kind of smooth, it's great. It's awesome. It's absolutely necessary. You use it all the time. So it's great. But it can be frustrating, actually. There's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of things involved with source control. So some of the frustration it could come from a tool that you're using. Maybe you're getting system generated messages that might as well be written in Martian. You're looking at this going, well, I don't know what you're trying to tell me to do. I don't get what this message is about. Or it could be user error. We users will make mistakes. We think we understand what we're supposed to do, or maybe we don't, and then we do something at the wrong time or do the wrong thing. That could happen too. So that's just maybe a lack of experience or knowledge about source control. So these are the things that I want to tackle in this video series. And yes, it is a video series. It's more than one video. There's actually 11 videos in this. This is the first one. And that's because source control is one of those subjects. There's a lot. There's a lot to unpack, and there's no way I could do it in just one video. So I'm going to spread this out over multiple videos. So what I'm going to talk about in this video, this is the introduction. So I'm going to talk about what is source control, why use it, what are the reasons for even using it. We'll talk about the different providers, the different source control providers, third-party systems that you can integrate your Flare project with. We'll talk about other tools that you can use to interact with source control tasks, because you can use absolutely Flare interface, but there's other things that you could use as well. After that, we'll talk about what are the files in your project that you can add to source control and the ones that you want to avoid adding to source control. And then finally, I'll just wrap up by going through the rest of the videos in this video series, what I am going to talk about down the road. So that's what we have ahead of us. Ready to get started? Let's do it. What is source control? Maybe you're brand new and you've heard of source control, maybe, but you're not exactly sure what it is, if you should use it. What is it? Well, source control, just to boil it all down, it's a system, or it's a practice of managing changes to your files. And I'm talking in this video series specifically about source control as it's used with MadCap Flare, with your Flare project. So you're managing changes to your Flare project files, and you have a connection to a remote location. So you have really a clone of your project files up somewhere else. And what you're doing is you're keeping the files that are local on your computer that you're working on, you're keeping those synced with that remote location. Okay, so you are constantly sending changes up to that remote location, and you're also bringing changes down, changes that you don't have locally. You're bringing those down from the remote location down to your computer. Why would you have changes up remotely that you don't have on your computer? Well, if you have other team members, other writers who are working on the same Flare project, they're also bound to source control. They're working away too, and they're sending their files, their changes up to the remote location. And you got to get theirs. You got to get their changes just like they got to get your changes. So it's this way of keeping everything synchronized, the file changes as you work. That's a real simplified explanation of what source control is. There's a whole lot more to it than just that. But if you just think about, what really what's the simplest way to think of it? That's it. That's it. That remote location, keeping things synced with that. All right. That is what source control is. Now, why would you want to use source control at all? So there are a few big reasons why people use source control. I've already alluded to one of the big ones, and that is you're working with a team of other writers. You're all on the same Flare project, and you got to keep all of your changes synchronized. This person's doing this person's doing that. And you want to get their changes. You want them to get your changes. What you don't want to do is take your Flare project, create one Flare project, put it up on a network drive, and have everybody just working there on this remote server. You want to be working locally. If you do that, if you put it up on a network drive and everybody's just in there, that's going to be a big mess. You don't want to do that. You want to use source control. Another good reason to use source control actually is simply that it's a backup. Even if you're a lone writer, you can use source control, because imagine if you've got your Flare project on your laptop, and that's the only place where you have it, and it gets stolen, or you get the blue screen of death, or you drop it in the street, gets run over by a bus, and you lose it. That would be terrible. So if you are connected to a source control solution, you can always get that stuff back. If something happened locally, you can always import from source control, at least the files in the state that they were the last time that you uploaded things. And another reason to use source control has to do with this concept of branching, which might have another name depending on the source control provider that you're using. But branching is a really fantastic way to work more quickly in an agile environment, where you've really got to be able to organize things and not be crossing lines of all the different things that you're documenting. So it allows you to do continuous development. So you might be working on lots of different things, writing lots of different features, but you're not sure what's going to be released at what time. Well, by using branching, you can have variations of your Flare project, so that maybe you're working away on one feature, and then later you work away on another one, but they're not colliding, and they're not merged until you tell them to merge. So that is this idea of branching. It's absolutely fantastic. I've been using it for quite a while now, and I rely heavily on it. So much so that actually later in this video series, I'm actually going to do 4 different movies on branching, because there's a lot to talk about. And I think it's really, really useful for people. So those are 3 big reasons to use source control. Now, what's the downside? Well, there's not a lot of downside, other than, like I mentioned before, it can get frustrating at times if you're not sure what you're doing, or you get weird messages or something. And the other thing is, when you bind a Flare project to source control, typically the performance goes down somewhat. So things are just going to take a little bit longer. Like, I'll open up my Content Explorer and I've got lots and lots of folders and subfolders in there. It just takes a little bit longer for that to load than if I wasn't bound to source control. But as far as I'm concerned, that's a small issue compared to the benefits that I get from source control. So those are some reasons why you should use source control. All right, so you decide you're going to use source control. Well, there are a few options you have for integrating your Flare project. Flare integrates with 4 different third-party source control providers. First one is Git, that might be the most popular one. In the last few years, it's gained in a lot of popularity. There is Perforce Helix Core, that's very popular. Subversion, that's the third one, that's very popular. There's also Azure DevOps, or it used to be called Team Foundation Server. And those are the 4 basic ones. But in addition to those, you can also bind your project to MadCap Central. Central is MadCap Software's cloud-based platform. And you can use that. It uses actually Git behind the scenes. So that's what you're really using is Git, but it's more than a source control solution. There's a whole lot more that you can do with Central, but it does that as well. Okay, so those different source control solutions, they basically all do the same thing. It's what I was talking about with sending your file changes up and then bringing file changes back down. They all do that. Now they'll use different terminology. Git has this idea of commits, and you're pushing and pulling things. TFS, Team Foundation Server, or Azure DevOps, you're doing a get and you're checking things in, checking things out. Perforce, you're submitting files. So they have different terminology, but really you're talking mostly about the same thing. Okay. One area where Git is different from the others is that it uses distributed development instead of more of a centralized development. What that means is with most source control providers, each writer is working there locally, and you have one centralized hub where things are going. But with Git, it's distributed. So you have that hub that's up there remotely, but each writer also is their own hub. They have a repository locally, and there's the repository up on the server that they're pointing to. So it's just a little bit different, and there's actually some really good advantages to doing it that way. All right. So, but these source control providers, any of them are great to use. And what happens is you join a company, you work for a company, and a lot of times you just kind of inherit whatever they're using. That's what you learn to use. So if you're using one of those, you can integrate with Flare. Now, if you're not using anything yet, I do recommend Git. Not that I don't recommend the others. It's just that my experience has been with Git and also with MadCap Central. And so I would definitely recommend using that. But if you're using one of the others, those are great solutions as well. All right. Now, as I work through the rest of the videos in this series, I will talk about to a certain extent, each of these providers, the basic processes, the basic steps, and some of the extra things that you can do. But most of the details, when I start getting into a lot of details and actually showing my screen and going through things, a lot of it is going to be Git. That doesn't mean you're not going to get anything from this video series if you're using one of the other providers. I just want to let you know right up front, I am going to be focusing a lot on showing how this is done with Git and with MadCap Central. Okay, so when you bind your Flare project to source control, you should know that there are a variety of tools that you can actually use for this. So let's split these up into two categories here. First of all, there's the host. There is that remote location, right, where that you are connecting to. And so it's outside of the scope of this video series for me to go through setting up, Subversion on a server somewhere, or Perforce or something like that. You will need to work with someone in your company and get that set up. I've never actually done that, but there are also services available that are just there on the internet that you can use. So for example, GitHub, if you're going to be using Git, you can create repositories on github.com. I've done that before for testing. Some of the others that you have is other options that you have for hosting is for Git and TFS, Team Foundation Server. You can set things up on an Azure DevOps server. And that's actually what I've used for years. We use it here. I didn't set that up. Somebody else did. And then I just connected to it. So I just kind of inherited that. There's also things like Bitbucket, which you can use for Git. Or you could you've got a server and you set up your Perforce depot or your Subversion repository. Another option that you have, I've mentioned, those four source control providers, and then there's Central. Well, Central was created to help alleviate some of the pain points that people have with source control and with other things. And one of the problems that people have is that, yeah, they want to use source control, but they don't know how to set it up. They don't, and maybe they're a small shop, a small company, and there just isn't anybody there. Well, you get a Central license and it's just done for you. It's super easy to connect your Flare project to that. And so you don't have to worry about setting that up. And like I say, you are using Git, but you don't have to worry about really creating these things on the remote end. It's just kind of done for you. But you have all of these options. So you got the host, right? But then there's also tools for interacting. The interaction between your Flare project and that remote location, that remote hub, that remote repository, right? So you can obviously use Flare. Flare has a lot of options in the interface, and the interface changes depending on the source control provider. So if you bind to Subversion, the source control ribbon at the top of Flare is going to look different than it does if you connect to TFS or Git or Perforce. All right. So you can use options in the Flare interface, but you can use a tool that's outside of Flare too. That's fine. Let's actually talk through some of those. So one of those, if you're using Git, you can use Git Bash. So that's a command line tool. So it's not a graphical user interface. You're getting into the command line and you're actually typing commands in there, and you have to know exactly how to type the commands. But you can use Git Bash. You can use Source Tree also for Git. For Git and for Team Foundation Server, you can use Visual Studio. I've used Visual Studio for years. Once again, another thing that I just inherited. That's just what we've used. So I had to learn to use Visual Studio. All right, in addition to Flare. There's also Tortoise Git. There's Tortoise Subversion. You can use those. You can use P4V, which is a Helix Visual Client if you're using Perforce Helix Core. So there are other options there. So why would you use something outside of Flare? Well, any of these tools that are graphical user interfaces, a lot of times they'll provide the options for the most common things that you're going to do with that provider, right? So like Git has all kinds of commands. Well, you go into Flare, you go into the source control ribbon or the source control explorer, and you're going to find some of the most common things that you have to do, things that you do daily, right? But there are all these kind of obscure commands that you can run, but these graphical user interfaces don't always include those because they're just not as common, and it's not worth their while to add things for every little thing. All right. So you might find yourself actually using more than one tool for this. I do. So I will use the Flare interface because I don't have to open up something else. It's just right there. And I'm bound to Central. So I'm using Git behind the scenes, and I will be doing pulls and pushes, synchronize and commits, and it's all right there. And it's very easy. I don't have to go to another tool. But there are some things that aren't in the Flare interface. So like I said, I've used Visual Studio for years. So I will go into Visual Studio. I'm familiar with it. And if I have to do something that I can't get done in Flare, I might use Visual Studio. And then if there's something else that I can't even do in Visual Studio, I'll use Git Bash. I'll go straight into the command line and I'll type the command in there. So you have options. You've got options. Just wanted to make you aware of it. Yeah. So just look into it, research it, whatever you want to do. Maybe if you're just getting started, you just worry about using the most basic things that you're going to be using 99% of the time, and you use Flare. All right. That is it for different tools that you have available to you. Okay, one thing I want to talk about real quickly is what Flare files are you going to include in your source control? Now, when you bind from Flare's interface, you bind to a source control solution, Flare's going to handle this for you. The files and folders that you want to not include in your source control activity. Number one is your analysis folder. When you create a Flare project and you go into Windows Explorer, you look at that location, you're going to see this analysis folder. So it's scanning and it's providing reports based on what's going on in your Flare project. You also have your output folder. You don't want to include that. In your projects folder, which is synonymous with project organizer, the project organizer and the Flare interface, you have all of those subfolders. Those, yeah, you want to include those, but not the users one. The users subfolder in there as information about you, the specific user. So you want to avoid, you don't want to include those in source control. Now, like I said, when you integrate, when you bind from Flare, it's going to exclude those things. It's going to set those to be ignored. In fact, if you bind to Git and you go into Windows Explorer and you look where those folders, your project folders and files are, you're going to see the main things, but you're also going to see Git ignore file in there. And so that is what's used to tell the system, hey, don't include this stuff. Now, one extra bit of information about the output. I did say don't include the output. I'm talking about when you are dealing with your source files. All right. Now, Flare does have a feature where you can publish your output files to source control. That's a different thing. All right. I'm really mainly talking in this video series about your source files, but you do have the option using a publishing destination in Flare, just like you can use publishing destinations for, lots of things, sending your output up to ServiceNow or to, just to a location on your computer. You can also publish using a publishing destination in Flare to source control. All right, that is another thing. So that is where you would use the output folders, but otherwise you want to ignore the other folders, those folders and files that I mentioned. So if you happen to be outside of Flare and you are hooking some things up there, most people aren't going to do that, but you're wondering what are the things I should not use, those are the ones. Just wanted to do a quick little section on that. All right, finally, I just kind of want to walk through with you the videos that are on the way that fill out the rest of this video series. So after this one, the next video is going to be about binding and importing Flare projects. So I've kind of talked about binding. So we're going to go a little bit more into that, but there's also importing, because if you've got a team of writers, one person can bind it, but the others have to import it. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about single bound and dual bound setups, right? So this comes into play if you're not using MadCap Central. You're always going to be single bound and you don't really need to worry too much. But if you are using MadCap Central, there are a couple of configurations. One is called single bound. Another one is called dual bound, where you can use Central plus something else. All right, so we're going to go into that. And we'll also talk about migrating from dual bound to single bound in case you have been using a dual bound setup, how you can go to a single bound setup, which is actually preferred. It's more simplified. It's much easier. All right. After that, I will go over the essential processes and steps for each of the different providers that I mentioned, the things that you are going to be doing all the time, the main things. Then I'll talk about other source control activities, because beyond the main things, there are some additional things you don't do as often, but you should know about, and I'll talk about those. Then I am going to do 4 videos on branching, because branching is really cool, really important, but there's a lot to talk about. So I'm going to start out by I'm going to have an overview of branching. Then I am going to talk about a system, a workflow called Git Flow and branching. And I'll go through that in detail. It's what I use, and it really, really helped me when I first started using branching. Then I'm going to talk about the main branching activities, just like there are the main source control activities. If you're using branching, there are the main branching activities, and then there are additional other branching activities. That's a separate movie. All right. Then I'm going to get to conflicts, the thing that everybody hates. So when you are working with source control and you've got other writers, and your changes collide, and you get conflicts, and you have to deal with those. So we're going to do a video on conflicts, and we're going to round it out. I'm going to finish it off with a video on tips, tricks, and best practices. So no matter what source control provider you're using, no matter, if you've got a team of writers on it or not, or you're a lone writer, there's something in that for you. Just things that I've picked up over the years that I want to convey. So that's what we have ahead of us in this video series. All right, so what did we learn? Well, we learned that source control can be very cool, but frustrating, but you'll get through it, and it is worth it. It's worth it to use source control. You want to use source control if you're on a team of writers, absolutely, that's the best thing to do. It's also good as a backup, and it's great if you want to get involved with branching. There's different source control providers that you can choose from. You might inherit one, or you can choose one. Git. You can bind to Central, Perforce, Subversion, Azure DevOps, TFS. All right, lots of tools, lots of different tools that you can use in addition to using the Flare interface. Lots of different things. So might want to look into those things. The files that you should ignore, the files that you shouldn't include in the source control process. And we looked at the videos that we've got ahead of us, a lot of those. So there we go, a lot behind us, but a lot more that we got to cover. So I will see you in the next video.